The hour was a thief, cloaked in the pre-dawn grey of London, a sliver of time that belonged neither to the night nor the day. It was in this spectral moment that Ilara Vance made her plea. She stood before a man whose face was a collection of shadows and hard angles, glimpsed in the guttering light of a single tallow candle held by a bleary-eyed priest. The chapel smelled of damp stone and desperation. Her desperation. Her voice, a fragile thread of sound, was nearly lost in the cavernous silence. "Marry me," she whispered, the words tasting of finality and fear. "Marry me before sunrise." Her guardian, her uncle, had sold her. The contract was to be signed at 9 o'clock, a transaction that would deliver her to a man whose cruelty was a whispered legend in the drawing rooms she no longer frequented. This clandestine ceremony was her only escape, a leap into an abyss to avoid a guaranteed inferno. The stranger said nothing. He was tall, his greatcoat smelling of wet wool and the cold night air. He had been the only soul in the cobbled alley behind the forgotten church, a silhouette against the rising mist. And she had run to him with the last of her strength. He had listened to her frantic, disjointed explanation without interruption, his stillness a stark contrast to her trembling. Now, in the hollow sanctity of the chapel, his silence was an answer in itself. It was a refusal. Hope, a flickering, foolish thing, began to die in her chest. She swayed, the chill of the flagstones seeping through the thin soles of her slippers. Her lungs, always treacherous, seized in a cough that tore through her slight frame, leaving her breathless and dizzy. When the spasm passed, she saw his hand, gloved in dark leather, extended towards her. Not in comfort, but in a gesture of grim acceptance. He turned his gaze to the priest. "Proceed," he commanded. His voice was deep, resonant, accustomed to being obeyed. It held no warmth, no pity. It was the sound of a lock turning in a heavy door. The priest, a man whose poverty had made him amenable to such irregular services, fumbled with his book. The words were rushed, a mumbled incantation against the coming dawn. Ilara gave her name, her voice barely audible. When it was the stranger's turn, he did not offer a name. He simply took the quill from the priest, dipped it in the pot of ink on the dusty register, and wrote 2 words in a bold, slashing script. He straightened, his part in the grim pantomime complete. The priest peered at the signature, his eyes widening in the candlelight. He looked from the book to the man, then back again, a sudden, fearful understanding dawning on his face. He bowed his head, saying nothing more. The stranger turned to Ilara. From a pocket, he produced a heavy purse that clinked with the solid sound of gold sovereigns, and a folded, sealed document. He pressed them into her cold hands. "You have my name, madam," he said, his tone as remote as a winter sky. "This is the deed to Blackwood Manor, in the north. It is yours. Go there. I require nothing from you but your absence." He did not say, "Live well," or "Be at peace." The unspoken sentiment was clear. Go there and be forgotten. Go there and die quietly, where you will not be a bother. He turned and walked away without a backward glance. The heavy oak door of the chapel groaned open and shut. and he was gone. Alara was left standing in the near darkness, a wife, a duchess, and an exile. The priest, avoiding her eyes, scurried to snuff the candle. She stumbled out into the alleyway just as the first true light of morning broke over the soot-stained rooftops. The sun was rising on her wedding day, and she had never felt more alone, more utterly abandoned. She clutched the deed in one hand and the purse in the other. Blackwood Manor. It sounded less like a home and more like a final resting place. For a woman with a ruined name, a traitorous body, and a husband who was nothing but 2 words in a dusty book, perhaps it was the most fitting destination. The journey north was a purgatory of jolting carriage wheels and rattling window panes. Each mile pulled her further from the world she knew and deeper into an unforgiving landscape of slate-grey skies and skeletal trees. Her cough worsened with the damp air, a constant rattling companion in the suffocating confines of the public coach. By the time the carriage left her at a crossroads marked by a leaning, moss-eaten signpost that read, Blackwood, she was a ghost of herself, burning with fever and chilled to the bone. A local man with a rickety cart had been paid to take her the final few miles. He eyed her pale face and threadbare cloak with a mixture of pity and suspicion, speaking little as they wound their way up a track that seemed determined to disappear back into the wilderness. The first sight of the manor was a blow to her already fragile spirit. It did not rise from the landscape so much as slump into it, a great, wounded beast of a house. Stone walls were stained black with damp, and entire sections of the roof had surrendered to the sky, leaving gaping wounds. Windows were either boarded up or stared out like vacant eyes. The drive was a choked artery of weeds and fallen branches, and the great iron gates hung from their hinges like broken teeth. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with the smell of decay, of wet earth and rotting leaves. It was a place that had been left to die, and it had been doing so for a very long time. An elderly woman with a face as grim as the house itself opened the door. She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Her gaze swept over Alara, taking in the cheap fabric of her dress, the feverish flush on her cheeks, and the title she claimed with a breathy, uncertain voice. Disbelief and resentment warred in the woman's tired eyes. She led Alara into a hall that was a cavern of cold and shadow. Dust motes danced like frantic spirits in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom. Furniture huddled under spectral white sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and memory. "The Duke has not been here in 20 years, Mrs. Gable stated, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. Not since the old Duke, his father, passed, and the Duchess before him. The words hung in the air, an unspoken accusation. Who are you to be here now? Alara was shown to a room in a wing that was deemed least ruinous. The plaster on the walls was a cracked and peeling map of neglect, and a persistent drip from the ceiling kept time like a mournful clock, falling into a strategically placed bucket in the corner. The bed was a vast, canopied monstrosity, the linen smelling faintly of damp and lavender. There were only 2 other servants in the entire house, a young girl named Mary with frightened eyes, and an old man called Silas, who tended to what was left of the gardens and saw to the horses. They were the last remnants of a forgotten court, moving through the decaying halls like ghosts themselves. The first weeks were a blur of fever and shivering fits. Ilara was confined to the massive, cold bed, the illness in her lungs flourishing in the damp, unforgiving air of Blackwood. Mrs. Gable tended to her with a reluctant, grudging care, bringing thin broth and herbal teas that did little to quell the fire in her chest. Lying in the semi-darkness, Ilara would listen to the house groan and settle around her. It was a living thing, but it was dying. The wind moaned through the broken panes of glass like a keening mourner. The drip in the bucket was a constant, maddening metronome counting down her final hours. She was an unwelcome guest in a house that was actively trying to consume her, to pull her down into its own slow, inexorable decay. This, she thought in a moment of fevered clarity, was what he had intended, a quiet, tidy end. A duchess nobody knew, buried in a place nobody visited. Loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest as much as the sickness. She had no one. Her family had cast her out, her friends had been a fiction of her former social standing, and her husband was a phantom, a name in a book who had bought her life for the price of a remote tomb. Despair was a cold tide, rising higher each day. She would lie awake for hours, tracing the water stains on the ceiling, imagining them as maps of countries she would never see, of a life she would never live. The house was her prison, her sickbed was her cell, and her own body was the most intimate of traitors. Then came the night the fever broke. She awoke near dawn, drenched in sweat, but the fire behind her eyes had receded. Her mind, for the first time in weeks, was clear. The air in the room was stale, thick with the smell of sickness and resignation. The drip from the ceiling continued its relentless percussion. In that moment, something shifted within her. It was not a grand epiphany, not a surge of heroic strength. It was a small, hard knot of defiance tightening in the pit of her stomach. She had run from a monster, only to be delivered to a slow, creeping death. She had fought for her life in that pre-dawn chapel, and she would not surrender it now to damp stone and indifference. With painstaking effort, she pushed herself out of the bed. Her legs trembled, weak from disuse, but they held. She shuffled to the tall, grimy window, her bare feet recoiling from the cold floorboards. The latch was rusted shut. She threw her frail weight against it, once, twice, and on the third try it gave way with a screech of protest. The window swung open, and the air that flooded the room was sharp, clean, and shockingly cold. It smelled of wet earth, of pine, and of the coming spring. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass, drawing the air deep into her aching lungs. It was the first breath of her new life. It was a declaration of war against the decay that surrounded her and the weakness that inhabited her. She would not be a ghost in this house. She would be its mistress. She would live. Her first act as the self-proclaimed mistress of Blackwood was to demand a broom. Mrs. Gable looked at her as if she had sprouted a second head, but the new, quiet steel in Ilara's voice was something the housekeeper had not heard before. She returned with a worn broom and watched, arms crossed, as Ilara began to sweep the dust of ages from her chamber floor. It was a small act, but it was a beginning. The next day she made her way to the kitchens. They were vast and cold, most of the hearths long dormant. She asked Mary for the household account books. The girl returned with a single, slim, leather-bound volume. Its pages were filled with Mrs. Gable's spidery script, a simple record of meagre expenditures. Candles, flour, oats for the one remaining horse. "Are these all?" Ilara asked, her voice still weak but firm. Mrs. Gable sniffed. "It is all that is required. The Duke's man of business in York sends a stipend. It is enough to keep us from starving." Barely. Ilara knew there had to be more. An estate of this size, even in ruin, had to have ledgers, records of tenancy, of yields, of debts and assets. Her father, a gentle scholar who had mismanaged his own small barony into near penury, had nevertheless insisted she learn the arts of accounting and estate management. "A lady should understand the foundations upon which her home is built, even if she never lays a stone," he used to say. She had thought it a peculiar education, but now it felt like a weapon. She spent the next week searching. She found them in the library, a room so choked with dust and neglect that the air was unbreathable. The books were piled in a corner, their leather covers blooming with mould. They were a chaotic history of mismanagement and theft. For the first time since her arrival, Ilara felt a spark of something other than defiance. She felt a flicker of purpose. She had the books moved to the one room with a solid roof and a fireplace that drew properly, the small morning room. Day after day she sat there, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a pen in her hand, slowly, meticulously untangling the knotted threads of Blackwood's finances. She learnt that the estate was rich in timber, but the profits had been siphoned off for years by a steward who had retired shortly before her arrival. She learned that tenant rents were collected sporadically, and that several farms on the property lay fallow, their former inhabitants driven away by neglect. The stipend from York was a pittance, a calculated sum to maintain the illusion of a functioning estate, while it was bled dry. Her body was still weak, but her mind was sharp. She began to write letters. Her first was to the man of business in York, a polite but firm inquiry that requested a full accounting of all funds related to the Blackwood ducal estate. Her second was to a timber merchant in a nearby town, proposing the sale of a small, carefully selected parcel of woods that were already blighted to raise immediate capital. She used the ducal seal, which she had found on an old letterpress in the library, lending her correspondence an authority that her name alone could not. Slowly, cautiously, things began to change. The man of business, startled by the sudden incisive scrutiny from the forgotten estate, sent back a flustered reply and a slightly larger sum of money. The timber merchant, intrigued, agreed to a meeting. Ilara, dressed in a mended gown that had once belonged to the previous Duchess, met him in the dusty great hall and negotiated a price that was fair but not desperate. With the money, she hired local men to begin repairing the roof over the main wing. The constant, maddening drip in her room finally stopped. The servants watched this transformation with a stunned silence that gradually morphed into a grudging respect. Mrs. Gable found herself taking orders from the pale, quiet young woman who seemed to know more about running an estate than anyone she had ever met. Ilara enlisted Silas's knowledge of the land, poring over old maps with him to determine which fields were best suited for new crops. She turned a section of the overgrown ornamental gardens into a vast kitchen garden, working alongside Mary to till the soil until her hands were raw. The house was still a ruin, but it was a ruin with a flicker of life in its heart. The smell of baking bread began to replace the scent of mildew. The sound of hammers on slate replaced the mournful cry of the wind through broken tiles. Ilara was not just surviving, she was rebuilding. She was taking the tomb she had been given and breathing life back into it. One balanced ledger, one repaired roof slate, one planted seed at a time. Blackwood was becoming her own, and she, in turn, was becoming its Duchess in truth, not just in name. 3 years passed. They were years etched in hard work and small victories. The north wing of the manor was now habitable, its windows gleaming, its roof sound. The fields were productive, yielding crops that not only fed the household, but also generated a modest income. The tenants, whose loyalty Ilara had won with fair rents and honest dealings, spoke of the new Duchess with a quiet reverence. She was no longer the frail, feverish girl who had arrived at their gates. Her health, nurtured by clean air and purposeful work, had returned. She was still slender, but there was a strength in her posture, a clarity in her gaze. Blackwood was her domain, a world she had built from ruins with her own 2 hands, and a mind that saw order in chaos. She rarely thought of the man who had sent her here. He was a ghost, a signature in a book, the architect of a life she had refused to live. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, returned to England on a grey Tuesday in October. The past 3 years had been a blur of diplomatic manoeuvring and political skirmishes on the continent, a necessary exile to untangle the last of his father's disastrous foreign investments. He was bone-weary. The ghosts of his past, the brother lost in the war, the father lost to grief and debt, walked with him still. He craved silence, oblivion. He craved the one place on earth he owned that demanded nothing of him, the place he had sent a half-dead girl to be forgotten. He sought the cold, quiet ruin of Blackwood Manor. He dismissed his carriage at the crossroads, choosing to walk the final miles, wanting to immerse himself in the familiar melancholy of the place. But the track was different. It was clear, the ruts filled, the overhanging branches trimmed back. He rounded the final bend and stopped dead. The gates were not hanging from their hinges. They were repaired, black iron set firmly in their stone posts, and they stood open in welcome. Beyond them, the drive was clear, lined with young, well-tended trees, and the house. The house was not a ruin. Smoke curled from a dozen chimneys, a warm, inviting plume against the bruised twilight sky. The windows were not vacant eyes. They shone with the golden light of lamps and fires. A sense of profound disorientation washed over him. This was not the tomb he remembered. This was a home. He walked up the drive, his boots crunching on the fresh gravel, a sound that felt alien and intrusive. He pushed open the great oak door, which swung smoothly and silently on well-oiled hinges. The great hall was not a cavern of dust and shadow. It was clean, warm, and smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the massive hearth, and the portraits of his ancestors, cleaned of their grime, seemed to stare down at him with expressions of stern surprise. He heard a voice from the gardens, a woman's voice, clear and confident, giving instructions about winter mulching. He walked through the hall to the French doors that led to the terrace. There, her back to him, stood a woman in a simple wool dress, her dark hair pinned up in a practical knot. She was speaking to old Silas the gardener, pointing to a row of rose bushes. There was an authority in her stance, a deep, settled sense of belonging. She was the mistress of this place. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who she was. The frail, coughing girl from the chapel, the one he had dispatched with a purse and a deed, expecting her to fade away as quietly as a whisper. He had not even remembered her name until this very moment. Ilara. He must have made a sound, a shifting of his weight on the stone flags, because she turned. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of grey, widened slightly as they fell upon him. There was no fear in them, no recognition of a saviour or a long-lost husband. There was only the cool, appraising look one gives a stranger who has appeared unannounced in one's private garden. He felt a fool, an intruder in his own home. The words that came out of his mouth were clumsy, inadequate, a blunt instrument against the delicate reality of her presence. "You're alive," he said, the words sounding hollow and absurd in the quiet air. A small, ironic smile touched her lips, but it did not reach her eyes. She inclined her head, a gesture of perfect, chilling politeness. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as calm and steady as a deep river. "An unexpected pleasure. I do apologize for the inconvenience of my survival." She turned back to Silas. "See to the mulching, Silas. We are finished for today." With a dismissive nod, the old gardener shuffled away, leaving them alone on the terrace. She then turned her full attention back to him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The silence stretched, and he realized with a jolt that she was waiting for him to explain himself, to state his business. In her world, the world she had built, he was the complication, the disruption to a well-ordered day. "I did not expect this," he managed, gesturing vaguely at the house, the gardens, at her. "No," she agreed, her tone neutral. "I imagine you did not. You expected a ruin, perhaps a small, unmarked grave. It would have been far tidier." There was no anger in her voice, only a statement of fact that was more cutting than any tirade. She treated him not as a husband, but as a negligent landlord who had returned after years of absence to find the property unexpectedly improved. "Will you be staying long, Your Grace? I will have Mrs. Gable prepare a room." The question was not an invitation, but a practical inquiry. His presence was a logistical problem to be solved. He, the Duke of Blackwood, the man who held title to every stone and blade of grass, was being asked for his itinerary by the woman he had sent here to die. The world had tilted on its axis, and he was struggling to find his footing. He stayed. He told her it was for a week, then a month. He took the room she had prepared for him, a grand, cold chamber in the west wing, far from the warm, lived-in heart of the house she had carved out for herself. The first few weeks he did little but observe, wandering the halls of his ancestral home like a ghost. He was stunned by the sheer scale of her accomplishment. He asked for the estate ledgers, and she provided them without comment. They were immaculate. Every penny was accounted for, every transaction recorded in a neat, elegant hand. She had not just stemmed the tide of decay, she had reversed it. The estate was turning a profit for the first time in 50 years. He walked the fields with the tenants, who spoke of Her Grace with a mixture of awe and affection. They told him how she had renegotiated their leases, how she had invested in new equipment, how she had personally nursed a tenant's child through a fever. She had earned their loyalty, not commanded it. In the house, the servants deferred to her on every matter. They moved around him with a polite deference due his title. But it was Elara they sought for direction, for approval. She was the sun around which this small, thriving world revolved. He, on the other hand, was utterly superfluous. He attempted to assert his authority once, making a suggestion to the head stableman about rotating the horses' pastures. The man listened politely before saying, "A fine idea, Your Grace, but Her Grace has already arranged it. We made the switch last Tuesday." He tried to review the accounts, only to find them more organised and efficient than any his own men of business had ever produced. He was the Duke, the master of Blackwood, and yet he had no purpose here. The intricate, functioning machine of the estate ran perfectly without him. He found himself taking on tasks of simple physical labour, chopping wood for the fireplaces, mending a broken fence in a far pasture, just to feel the solid reality of useful work, to combat the growing sense of his own irrelevance. One evening, a carriage bearing a familiar imperious crest rolled up the drive. Alistair's heart sank. It was his aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood, a woman whose ambition and arrogance were legendary. She had ruled the family with an iron fist since his mother's death, and had always viewed the northern estate with a covetous eye. She swept into the great hall, her silks rustling, her lorgnette raised as she surveyed the restored interior. Her gaze landed on Elara, who stood waiting calmly, and dismissed her with a single contemptuous glance. "Alistair," she boomed, ignoring Elara completely. "I heard you had returned to this dreary pile. What is this I hear about some creature you installed here? You must send her away at once. It is a disgrace." Elara did not flinch. "I am Elara, Duchess of Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the cold weight of steel. "And you are a guest in my home." The Dowager laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your home? You are a nobody, a convenience he picked up in a back alley. The marriage is a farce. It can be annulled in a heartbeat. This house, this title, will go to a proper wife, one of my choosing." The confrontation unfolded over a tense, miserable dinner. The Dowager directed a relentless stream of veiled insults and outright slights at Elara, who met them with a shield of unshakable composure. Alistair watched, his gut twisting. He saw the scene through new eyes. He saw his aunt's casual cruelty for what it was, a brute force attempt to maintain power. And he saw Elara's quiet dignity as a form of strength he had never encountered before. She was not fighting back. She was simply refusing to be bowed. Finally, the dowager went too far. "You have done some commendable work here, I suppose," she said, gesturing with a dismissive wave of her fork. "Like a good little housekeeper. Once you are gone, I shall find you a suitable position, perhaps in the kitchens." Something inside Alistair snapped. He placed his wineglass down with a sharp click that silenced the table. "That is enough, Aunt," he said, his voice dangerously low. He turned to Ilara and for the first time looked at her not as a problem or a surprise, but as an ally, as his wife. "Ilara is the Duchess of Blackwood," he said, his gaze sweeping back to his stunned aunt. "She is the mistress of this house by right and by merit. She has saved this estate, my heritage, from the ruin our family's neglect had consigned it to. You speak of a proper wife. There is no one more proper, more worthy of the title than the woman sitting before you. You are the one who is a disgrace." He stood up. "Your carriage is waiting. You will leave Blackwood now, and you will not return." The Dowager Duchess was speechless, her face a mask of apoplectic rage. She rose, sputtering, and stormed from the room. A heavy silence descended in her wake. Ilara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Alistair had defended her, had claimed her publicly, but he knew this was not a victory. He had only just begun to understand the woman he was married to, and he suspected her gratitude would not be easily won. He had, after all, only done what a husband should have done 3 years ago. The aftermath of the Dowager's visit left a strange tension in the air. The external threat had been vanquished, but it had unsettled the quiet rhythm of their cohabitation. That night, a storm rolled in from the moors, a violent, percussive assault of wind and rain that rattled the window frames and sent draughts snaking through the old house. Alistair lay awake, his mind churning, the confrontation with his aunt replaying in his thoughts. Just after midnight, a crash of thunder, so loud it seemed to shake the manor to its foundations, was followed by the splintering sound of a falling tree in the near distance. He was on his feet before he was fully aware of it, the old, familiar adrenaline surging through him. It was the sound of artillery, of chaos, of the battlefield where he had lost his brother. His heart hammered against his ribs, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The walls of his grand chamber seemed to be closing in, the darkness thick and suffocating. He stumbled towards the door, driven by a primal need for air, for escape from the confines of his own mind. He found himself in the corridor, leaning against the wall, sweat beading on his forehead as the ghosts of the past rose up to claim him. A door opened down the hall, and a soft yellow light spilled into the darkness. It was Ilara. She held a candle, her hair unbound and falling over the shoulders of her simple white nightgown. She saw him, and her expression was not one of alarm or fear, but of a quiet, solemn understanding. She walked towards him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. "The storm?" she asked softly. He could only nod, unable to force words past the constriction in his throat. He felt exposed, stripped of his title, his authority, his carefully constructed defences. He was just a man, terrified in the dark. She did not coddle him or press for explanations. She simply reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cool and steady around his. "Breathe with me, Alistair," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the raging tempest of his panic. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and he found himself matching it, his gaze fixed on the small, steady flame of her candle. Inhale. Exhale. The roaring in his ears began to subside. The shaking in his limbs lessened. "You are here," she murmured, her thumb tracing a soothing circle on the back of his hand. "You are at Blackwood. You are safe." She led him not back to his own cold room, but to the small sitting room where she worked, the heart of the house. She settled him into a chair by the dying embers of the fire and put a glass of brandy into his hand. She sat opposite him, pulling a thick shawl around her shoulders, and simply waited. The silence was no longer a weapon or a void, but a space of quiet sanctuary. In that room, with the storm raging outside and the calm presence of this woman he barely knew before him, the walls he had built around his heart for a decade began to crumble. He started to speak. He told her about the war, about the campaign in Spain, about the explosion that had taken his younger brother and left him with scars no one could see. He spoke of the guilt that had consumed him, the sense that he had failed to protect the one person he was supposed to keep safe. It was a confession he had never made to another living soul. When he finished, his voice raw, the room was filled with the gentle sound of the rain and the ticking of the mantel clock. Ilara listened without interruption, her grey eyes full of an empathy that was more potent than any pity. When he fell silent, she spoke, her own voice soft with memory. "For the first year I was here," she said, her gaze fixed on the glowing embers, "I used to talk to the portraits in the great hall. They were the only ones who would listen. I told them about the cold and the fear and the loneliness that was so vast it felt like it would swallow me whole. I told them I was angry at the man who sent me here, but angrier at myself for being too weak to die." She looked at him then, and for the first time he saw past the capable Duchess, past the resilient survivor, to the abandoned girl who had fought her way back from the brink. They were two broken people, sent to this house of ruins for different reasons, and had, in their own ways, begun to heal it. And now, in this shared moment of vulnerability, they had begun to heal each other. He saw the story of his own neglect reflected in the pain in her eyes, and he felt a shame so profound it was a physical ache. He had not just abandoned a stranger. He had abandoned a soul as wounded as his own. The Dowager Duchess, however, was not a woman to accept defeat gracefully. Thwarted at Blackwood, she retreated to London and deployed her most formidable weapon: gossip. Whispers began to circulate through the drawing rooms and country houses. The new Duchess of Blackwood was an adventuress, a woman of low birth who had trapped the grieving, vulnerable Duke in a sham marriage. She was an upstart, a usurper. The story was crafted to isolate them, to make their position untenable, to force Alistair to cast Ilara aside to save his family's reputation. The first sign of the campaign's success came in the form of a returned invitation. A neighbouring lord, who had previously been cordial, was hosting his annual autumn ball, and their presence was now, politely, no longer required. More followed. They were being systematically excised from polite society. Ilara bore the snubs with her usual stoicism, but Alistair saw the faint shadow it cast in her eyes. She had built a world for herself at Blackwood, but it was a small one. He had brought the cruel, judgmental gaze of his world to her doorstep. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. A local magistrate, a man with aspirations of social climbing and a deep deference to the dowager's influence, invited them to a large harvest dinner. It was a public test. To refuse would be to admit defeat. To accept would be to walk into an ambush. "We will go," Alistair said, his voice firm. Ilara looked at him, a question in her eyes. "It will not be pleasant." "Pleasantness is a luxury," he replied. "Your position, our position, is not. We will face them together." The word "together" hung in the air between them, a new and fragile thing. The atmosphere at the dinner was thick with unspoken hostility. They were greeted with cool nods and averted eyes. They were seated at the far end of the long table, a clear signal of their diminished status. Throughout the meal, Alistair felt the weight of dozens of eyes on them, watching, judging. The dowager was not present, but her influence was a palpable poison in the room. The moment came after the main course. The magistrate, emboldened by wine and a sense of his own importance, rose to his feet. "We are all honoured," he began, his voice unctuous, "to have the Duke of Blackwood with us, a man who has served his country with honour. It is, therefore, a matter of some concern to his friends and neighbours to see his good name entangled in a hasty and irregular union." He did not look at Ilara, but his meaning was clear to everyone in the room. He was giving Alistair a public opportunity to renounce her. A hush fell over the room. Every eye was on Alistair. This was the moment of truth. He could save himself, his name, his standing, with a few carefully chosen words of dismissal. He felt Ilara beside him, perfectly still, her hands in her lap, her head held high. She expected nothing from him. She had never asked for anything from him. Alistair rose slowly to his feet. He did not look at the magistrate. He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every single person there. "You are right, Mr. Collins," he said, his voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the silence. "My union with my wife was indeed irregular. But the irregularity, the shame, is mine and mine alone." He turned and looked directly at Ilara, his heart in his eyes. "I wish to make a public confession. 3 years ago, I met a woman in desperate need. In an act of profound selfishness and cowardice, I gave her my name and then abandoned her. I sent her to a dying house on a forgotten piece of land and left her to perish. I did not have the decency to even learn her name properly. That is the man I was." He turned his gaze back to the stunned assembly. "The woman I abandoned did not perish. She lived. She took the ruin I gave her, and with her own intelligence, her own courage, her own tireless work, she brought it back to life. She saved my ancestral home. She earned the loyalty of my people. She restored the honour to the name of Blackwood that my family's neglect had tarnished. Everything you see at Blackwood that is good and whole and thriving is because of her." He reached down and took Ilara's hand, pulling her gently to her feet beside him. He kept his eyes on her, speaking now only to her, the rest of the room forgotten. "You are not the Duchess of Blackwood because I gave you a title, Elara. You are the Duchess of Blackwood because you are the soul of the place. You are more worthy of that name than I have ever been. My life was a ruin, just like that house. A cold, empty place haunted by ghosts. It only truly began the day I came home and found you there. I love you, and I will spend the rest of my days attempting to be a man worthy of being your husband." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of fealty, of devotion, of absolute surrender. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of a single, sharp intake of breath. The magistrate sat down, his face pale. The ambush had failed. In attempting to destroy her, they had only succeeded in revealing the depth of his devotion. The journey back to Blackwood was made in silence, but it was a silence charged with unspoken emotion. When they stepped into the warmth of the great hall, Alistair finally turned to face her. The firelight played across her features, and he could see the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I said—" "I heard you," she whispered. "I was a ghost," he said, stepping closer, his hands finding hers. "I was sleepwalking through my life, buried in grief and duty. You woke me up. You saved me from myself. You are not just the heart of this house. You are the heart of my life. You are my home." She looked up at him, and the formidable composure of the Duchess gave way to the vulnerability of the woman who had stood alone for so long. "I am tired of being strong by myself, Alistair," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I do not want a saviour. I do not want a duke." "What do you want?" he asked, his heart aching. "I want a partner," she said, her gaze steady and clear. "Someone to walk beside me, not in front, not behind. Beside." "Then let me," he pleaded softly. "Let me be that man. Let me build a life with you, here, in the home we have both saved." She searched his face, looking for the cold stranger from the chapel, for the distant lord who had observed her from afar. But he was gone. In his place was a man whose eyes were filled with a love so profound, so raw and honest, it took her breath away. A slow smile, the first true, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her, dawned on her face. She raised a hand to his cheek. "All right, Alistair," she said softly. "Let us begin." He lowered his head and kissed her, not with the desperate plea of a man seeking forgiveness, but with the quiet promise of a man who had finally, truly, come home. A year later, the library at Blackwood Manor was a sanctuary of warmth and quiet industry. Sunlight, rich and golden, streamed through the tall, clean windows, illuminating the intricate patterns of the newly installed Turkish rug and gleaming on the polished spines of thousands of books. The scent of old paper and lemon oil had replaced the cloying smell of mould and decay. At a large oak desk placed in the centre of the room, Elara and Alistair sat opposite each other, poring over plans for a new mill to be built on the estate. This was their new reality, a partnership forged in the crucible of their shared past. Their days were a tapestry of shared responsibilities and quiet companionship. He handled the political and legal affairs of the duchy, his sharp mind finding a new purpose in protecting the world she had built. She remained the undisputed heart of the estate, her practical wisdom guiding its prosperity. They were a formidable team, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. The house was no longer a place of isolated survival, but a thriving, bustling home, often filled with the laughter of tenants' children invited for harvest festivals, or the lively debate of local landowners who now sought the Duke and Duchess's counsel. Alistair looked up from the architectural drawings and simply watched his wife. She was concentrating, a slight frown of focus on her brow as she made a calculation in a ledger, her pen moving with swift, certain strokes. The sunlight caught the dark sheen of her hair and the quiet strength in the line of her jaw. He felt a wave of love for her so powerful it was almost a physical ache. He remembered the haunted, desperate girl in the chapel, the formidable stranger in the garden, and the vulnerable woman who had stayed with him through a storm-tossed night. She was all of those things, and so much more. She was his compass, his anchor, his peace. She must have felt his gaze because she looked up, her expression softening as she met his eyes. "Is something amiss with the plans?" she asked. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "The plans are perfect." He reached across the desk and took her hand, the one not holding the pen. Her skin was warm, her fingers strong. He brought it to his lips. "I was just thinking that this room has changed." She smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "It is warmer now." "It is not the fire," he said. He looked around the room where she had found the ruined ledgers, the room where she had begun her impossible work of resurrection. This was once the coldest room in the house, a place of dust and forgetting. Now, he looked back at her, his heart in his eyes. Now, it is the center of the world. Their journey had not been a fairy tale of instant recognition or grand passion. It had been a slow, difficult rebuilding, much like the restoration of the manor itself. Their love was not a title they had been given, but a structure they had built together, day by day, with foundations of shared vulnerability, walls of mutual respect, and a roof of hard-won trust. A home was not a place you inherited, it was a place you created. And here, in the quiet sunlight of their shared library, surrounded by the fruits of their labour, Alistair knew he had found his. Not in the stone and mortar of Blackwood Manor, but in the steadfast, resilient heart of the woman who sat across from him, his partner, his duchess, his wife.